I stepped into the training yard wearing a faded t-shirt, a worn-out backpack, and my hair tied back in a loose, low ponytail. To the rest of the recruits, I probably looked like a logistics clerk who had taken a wrong turn on her way to the supply depot. It didn't take long for the laughing to start. Someone muttered loud enough for everyone to hear that the Army must be taking backstage volunteers now. A few minutes later, during our first combat drill, one of the guys decided to test me. He lunged forward, grabbed my collar, and yanked hard enough to rip my shirt clean down the back. "Girls like you are only good at hiding," he shouted, trying to psych me out. But as the torn fabric fell away, it exposed the ink on my shoulder blade. A veteran colonel who had been casually observing the drill suddenly froze. His eyes locked onto my back, and before anyone could process what was happening, he snapped to attention and threw up a rigid, dead serious salute. The entire training camp went dead quiet. This wasn't just some random body art. It was the classified emblem of Ghost Viper. To the rest of the world, I didn't belong there. I had rolled into the joint NATO training base driving an old beat-up pickup truck with chipped paint and tires caked in thick backcountry mud. Nobody looking at me would have guessed I grew up in one of the wealthiest families in the country, raised in a world of private tutors, manicured lawns, and gated estates. But I didn't carry any of that baggage with me. I didn't wear designer labels, I didn't have polished nails, and I didn't flash money around. I had a plain face, wore clothes that looked like they'd been through 100 wash cycles, and carried an old backpack held together by a single, stubborn strap. More than my looks, though, it was the way I carried myself that threw people off. I had this habit of just standing still, hands buried deep in my pockets, quietly observing the chaotic bass around me like I was waiting for a frequency only I could tune into. That first day was a total gauntlet. Captain Harrow, the head drill instructor, was built like a brick wall and had a voice that could instantly quiet a riot. He was pacing up and down the yard, sizing up the new line of cadets, when his eyes locked right onto me. "You!" he barked, jabbing a thick finger in my direction. "What's your deal?" Before I could answer, a voice from the crowd piped up. "Looks like the supply crew got lost, sir." The whole group started snickering. A girl named Tara, who sported a sharp blonde ponytail and a fake smile that never reached her eyes, turned to the guy next to her and whispered, "Bet she's just here to check a box. Gotta hit that gender quota, right?" I didn't blink. I kept my eyes locked on Harrow, my face completely expressionless. "I'm a cadet, sir," I said evenly. Harrow just snorted, waving his hand to dismiss me. "Get in line, then. Just don't slow my pack down." When lunch rolled around, I took my tray over to a secluded corner table in the mess hall, trying to avoid the noise. The room was buzzing as the recruits swapped exaggerated war stories, their voices loud and their egos even louder. A guy named Derek, lean, cocky, and rocking a fresh buzz cut, spotted me sitting by myself. He grabbed his tray, strutted over, and slammed it down onto my table with a loud clatter. "Yo, lost girl," he announced, making sure his voice carried to the surrounding tables. "This ain't a soup kitchen." He leaned in closer, a smug grin plastered across his face. "You sure you aren't supposed to be back there washing the dishes?" The table right behind him erupted into a chorus of laughs. I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth, and just looked at him. "I'm trying to eat," I said, keeping my voice dead steady. Derek leaned in even further, mocking me. "Yeah, well, chew faster. You're taking up space real soldiers need." To drive his point home, he flicked the edge of my tray. A spoonful of mashed potatoes flew up, splattering right across the front of my shirt. The entire mess hall howled with laughter. I didn't yell. I didn't jump up. I just grabbed a napkin and wiped off the mess with slow, deliberate movements, keeping my eyes fixed on my plate. I took another bite of my food like he didn't even exist, which only made his grin falter a bit. The afternoon warm-ups were designed to break us. We did push-ups until our arms shook like rubber, sprints that made our lungs feel like they were on fire, and burpees in the dirt under a blistering sun. I maintained a steady pace, keeping my breathing controlled, but my old, frayed shoelaces kept slipping loose. They were barely holding my boots together. During a grueling sprint, a guy named Lance jogged up right beside me. Lance was the golden boy of the elite recruits, broad-shouldered, athletic, and carrying the kind of arrogant smirk that told you he'd never lost a day in his life. "Hey, thrift store," he shouted over the noise of the boots hitting the dirt. "Are your shoes giving up on you, or is that just your body quitting?" Another ripple of laughter echoed through the ranks. I didn't waste my breath replying. Instead, I dropped to one knee, retied the laces with quick, practiced movements, and stood back up. But right as I straightened out, Lance intentionally slammed his shoulder into mine. The impact threw me off balance. I stumbled sideways, my hands hitting the thick mud, my knees sinking right into the wet earth. The platoon went wild. "What's the matter, Mitchell?" Lance jeered, looking down at me. "You signing up to clean these floors, or are you just volunteering to be our personal punching bag?" I got up without saying a single word, wiped my muddy palms on my trousers, and kept running. The sound of their laughter followed me all the way to the end of the track. During our midday break, I sat on a weathered wooden bench, pulling a generic granola bar out of my pack. Within seconds, Tara sauntered over with two of her friends, her arms crossed over her chest, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Olivia, right? So, where did you even come from?" she asked, tilting her head. "What happened? Did you win a radio contest to get a spot here?" Her friends giggled on cue, one of them covering her mouth like it was the funniest joke she'd ever heard. I chewed my food slowly, looked up into Tara's eyes, and gave her a completely flat response. I applied. Tara's fake smile tightened up real quick. She pressed further, leaning down into my space. "Okay, but why? You don't exactly scream high-caliber soldier material. I mean, look at your whole situation." She waved a dismissive hand at my muddy shirt and unstyled hair. I set the rest of my granola bar down on the bench. I leaned forward just an inch, doing it with an intensity that actually made Tara flinch back a step. "I'm here to train," I told her, my voice dropping to a whisper, "not to make you feel better about yourself." Tara froze, her cheeks instantly turning bright red. "Whatever, weirdo," she muttered, spinning around on her heel and marching off with her friends. The land navigation drill was a completely different beast. We were dropped into a dense forested ridge with nothing but a map and a compass, facing a strict timeline to reach the checkpoint. I moved out through the trees alone, my compass steady in my hand, my footsteps making almost no sound against the fallen pine needles. As I stopped under a large pine to check my coordinates, a group of 4 cadets led by a wiry guy named Kyle spotted me. Kyle had been desperately trying to compete with Lance for the alpha spot in the platoon, and he clearly saw me as an easy target to score points with the guys. "Hey, look, it's Dora the Explorer," he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet woods. "You lost already, or are you just out here picking wildflowers?" His crew laughed, closing the distance and circling around me. I didn't say a word. I folded my map with deliberate care and tried to keep walking, but Kyle jogged ahead and snatched the paper straight out of my hands. "Let's see how smart you are without this," he sneered, tearing the map clean down the middle and tossing the shredded pieces into the wind. The guys around him cheered. I stopped in my tracks, watching the white scraps flutter away into the brush. Then I turned my eyes to Kyle, my face completely blank. "I hope you know your way back," I said quietly. Then I turned around and kept walking forward into the brush, never breaking my stride. Kyle's laughter kind of petered out behind me, though his friends kept up their jeering to mask the awkward silence. That afternoon, they threw us into the rifle disassembly and reassembly drill, which turned out to be a massive wake-up call for the cockier recruits. We were given an M4 carbine and exactly 2 minutes to completely strip it down, clean the core components, and put it back together. Most of the cadets struggled hard. Their fingers fumbled with the takedown pins, and you could hear a steady stream of swearing as small parts slipped out of their sweaty hands. Lance finished with a pretty sloppy time of 1 minute and 43 seconds, though he still grinned like he'd set a world record. Tara barely scraped by at 1 minute and 59 seconds, her hands visibly shaking as she forced the last retaining pin into place. Then it was my turn to step up to the table. I didn't rush, and I didn't hesitate. My hands moved over the weapon like they were following a script I'd memorized in a past life. Pin out. Bolt carrier group free. Every single part was laid out on the table in a flawless, perfectly spaced grid. 52 seconds flat. Not a single misplaced part, not a single wasted movement. Sergeant Polk, the instructor running the clock, stared down at his digital timer, then looked up at me like he was seeing a ghost. "Mitchell," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" I grabbed a rag, wiped the carbon grease off my hands onto my pants, and stepped back into line. "Practice, sir," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground. On the nearby training monitor, the automated camera system played back a slow-motion replay of my run. Every transition was surgical. A lieutenant standing next to Polk leaned in and muttered, "Look at her hands. They didn't shake once. That's Special Forces steady." Lance overheard the comment and scoffed loudly. "So she can clean a rifle fast," he announced to the room. "Doesn't mean she can handle herself when the bullets start flying." But during our next short break, a quiet cadet named Elena, who had been watching me closely all day, casually walked past my bench. Without making eye contact, she slipped a spare topographical map from her own kit into my lap. "You'll need this," Elena whispered, her eyes quickly darting around to ensure none of the guys were looking. I took the map, gave her a single nod of acknowledgement, and tucked it securely into my bag without saying a word. The whispers started spreading through the barracks after that. A few of the cadets began glancing at me sideways during formations, clearly trying to piece together who I actually was. I didn't give them anything to work with. I just sat out on the grass, retying my worn boots, keeping my expressions locked down. Tara leaned over to Lance near the equipment lockers, her voice low but carrying a sharp edge. "I bet she's just got some pathetic sob story. Some poor kid from the middle of nowhere trying to prove she's actually a somebody." Lance chuckled, adjusting his gear. "Yeah, well, so far she's only proven she's a nobody." My fingers paused on my shoelaces for a fraction of a second when those words hit. Then, I went right back to tying the knot, my movements slow and deliberate, like I was sealing something dangerous deep inside myself. The next morning, we lined up at the equipment shed to draw our tactical gear for the upcoming field exercise. The quartermaster was an old, incredibly gruff veteran named Gibbs, and he was handing out vests and helmets with a permanent scowl on his face. When I stepped up to the counter, he stopped, looked me up and down, and let his lip curl in disgust. "What is this, a homeless convention?" he barked, ensuring the entire line heard him. "We don't carry gear for civilians, sweetheart." Instead of pulling a properly sized plate carrier, he grabbed a heavy vest that was at least 2 sizes too big and tossed it at me, the adjustment straps dangling uselessly down to the floor. The cadets stacked up behind me immediately started snickering. "Hey, Mitchell, you can use that thing as a sleeping bag," one of them shouted. I caught the heavy vest against my chest, my fingers tightening around the rough canvas. I didn't complain, and I didn't ask him to look for a smaller size. I just slung the massive piece of gear over my shoulder and walked out into the sunlight, my boots clicking against the concrete floor. Behind me, Gibbs just laughed and shook his head. "That one's gonna wash out by tomorrow morning," he told the rest of the room. Once I got outside, I sat down on a crate, pulled a tactical knife from my pocket, and used a few quick, precise cuts and custom knots to modify the heavy straps. Within 3 minutes, the oversized vest fit my frame perfectly. My hands moved with the exact same mechanical precision I'd used on the M4. The grueling terrain run began at dawn. It was a 10-mile trek over broken, rocky ground, carrying full combat loads with absolutely no breaks allowed. I kept myself right in the middle of the formation, keeping my breathing rhythmic and my steps steady. Tara was running right on my heels, spending the first 3 miles muttering insults under her breath. "Pick up the pace, charity case," she hissed, her breath ragged. You're dragging down our squad's average time. Right at the 5-mile marker, as we navigated a narrow, rocky bottleneck, Tara intentionally dug her elbow right into my side. The unexpected shove threw off my balance. My boot caught the edge of a jagged rock, and I veered sharply off the trail, my left ankle twisting violently as I hit the hard dirt. Captain Harrow saw the whole thing from the bed of the safety truck. "Mitchell!" he roared over the loudspeaker. "You broke formation. Your entire squad takes a point deduction." The group instantly groaned, and several recruits shot back angry, frustrated glares in my direction. Lance turned his head around, his face completely flushed from the exertion. "Nice job, Mitchell. Way to be a real team player." I didn't try to explain what Tara had done. I just pushed myself up from the dirt, forced my weight back onto my throbbing ankle, and re-entered the line. I kept running, locking my jaws so tight my teeth ached, keeping my limp so subtle it was almost invisible. When the 10 miles finally ended and the rest of the platoon collapsed onto the grass, Harrow walked over and pointed a thick finger right at my face. "Mitchell, 5 extra laps around the perimeter track for breaking ranks. Move it!" The others watched from the hydration station, a few of them smirking openly as I started running again, my breath coming in short, burning gasps. By the time I finished the extra miles, my face was slick with sweat, and I had to lean forward with my hands on my knees just to keep from collapsing. Nobody offered me a canteen. Tara walked past and tossed an empty plastic bottle right at my feet. "Go ahead and hydrate with some fresh air," she said, laughing as she walked toward the barracks. I didn't say a word. I just bent down, picked up the empty bottle, crushed it flat in my fist, and dropped it into a nearby trash bin. A few nights later, they threw us into a midnight perimeter drill. The instructors simulated a chaotic ambush, launching bright illumination flares into the night sky and screaming conflicting orders to disorient us. I worked alone in the dark, securing a heavy rope barrier around our sector with steady, methodical knots. A stocky, loudmouthed cadet named Marcus decided I was the perfect target to break the tension. He walked up, grabbed the main line I had just tensioned, and yanked it completely free from the anchor stake, letting it drop into the thick mud. "Oops," he said, flashing a massive grin. "Guess you just aren't cut out for tactical security, huh?" The other recruits nearby started laughing, their flashlight beams bouncing around in the dark as they watched the spectacle. I didn't yell at him. I simply knelt down in the dark, retrieved the muddy rope, and started the entire process over again, my fingers moving flawlessly by muscle memory. Marcus wasn't satisfied with that. He stepped closer and deliberately kicked a spray of loose dirt and gravel right onto my hands, coating the clean rope in thick grime. "Keep at it, princess," he mocked. "Maybe you'll actually finish it by sunrise." The circle of guys laughed loudly. I paused for a moment, my hands staying perfectly still against the dirt, and then I slowly looked up into his eyes. "Are you done?" I asked, my voice incredibly quiet, but razor sharp. Marcus blinked, completely thrown off by how calm I was, but he tried to laugh it off as he stepped back. I went right back to work, my face completely unreadable in the dark, and had the rope wiped clean and secured in a matter of seconds. Later that night, when the instructors conducted their final inspection, Marcus's own sector barrier was found completely loose and falling apart, costing his squad massive points. Nobody saw me anywhere near his station, but Elena, who was watching the inspection from across the yard, caught my eye and hid a tiny smile. Late that night in the dimly lit barracks, I sat on the edge of my bunk and pulled an old, creased photograph from the hidden compartment of my backpack. The edges of the paper were worn thin from years of handling. The photo showed a younger version of me standing next to a tall man wearing a plain black tactical jacket. His face was intentionally blurred out in the print, but his posture, shoulders thrown back, eyes sharp and intense, carried an undeniable, heavy authority. I traced my thumb over the blurred image, my lips pressing into a thin line, but the moment I heard heavy footsteps approaching down the aisle, I quickly tucked it back out of sight. Lance walked past my bunk, tossing a damp towel over his shoulder. "You better get some sleep, Mitchell," he called out mockingly. "Tomorrow we're hitting the long-range shooting range. Try not to choke under the pressure." I didn't even look up to acknowledge him. I just lay back on my thin mattress, locked my hands behind my head, and stared up at the concrete ceiling, keeping my breathing slow, rhythmic, and even. The long-range marksmanship qualification the next morning was a definitive make-or-break moment for the platoon. 5 shots, 400 meters. 5 perfect bullseyes, or you were pulled from the advanced track. The cadets were visibly sweating in the staging area, nervously adjusting their optic scopes and whispering anxiously about the shifting crosswinds. Tara went up to the firing line first. Her hands were shaking so badly she missed 2 targets entirely, her face turning pale as she was ordered to step back. Lance took his turn next, landing 4 out of 5, muttering a string of curses under his breath because he'd missed a perfect score. Then, my name was called. As I walked up to the sandbags, Tara whispered loudly to the girl next to her, "I bet she doesn't even know how to properly rest the stock." I settled into the prone position on the dirt. My movements weren't hurried. They were entirely mechanical, almost peaceful. I took a deep breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. 5 shots, 5 perfect dead-center bullseyes. There was no hesitation between my trigger's pulls, and I didn't even bother to touch the windage dials on the scope. The range safety officer blinked in disbelief as he looked through his spotting scope, then cleared his throat and called it out over the radio. "Mitchell, perfect score." A high-ranking colonel who had been watching the range from a distance, an older gentleman with a head of gray hair and a dress uniform covered in combat ribbons, leaned forward in his chair. "Who the hell trained that girl?" he murmured quietly to his administrative aide. "That is a Spec Ops trigger pull if I've ever seen one." Lance overheard the colonel's remark and rolled his eyes dramatically. "It was a total fluke," he muttered loud enough for me to hear. "Let's see how she handles a real hand-to-hand fight." But during the mandatory equipment inspection right after the range closed, the arms officer discovered that the rifle I had been handed actually had a severely misaligned front sight that nobody else had caught. I had managed to hit every single bullseye by instinctively calculating the mechanical error and compensating perfectly with every shot. The officer just shook his head, muttering, "That isn't luck. That's pure muscle memory." The following day in the mess hall, my tray was completely empty. I had been stuck at the very back of the formation line, and by the time I reached the counter, the kitchen staff had completely run out of the main lunch rations. I went over and sat down at my usual corner table anyway, just sipping from a glass of water with a calm face. A group of elite recruits led by a girl named Jenna saw me sitting there with nothing and decided it was time to have some fun. Jenna was tall, incredibly smug, and possessed a loud laugh that always carried across the room. She walked right over to my table and dropped a half-eaten apple directly onto my empty metal tray. "Here you go," she said, her voice dripping with exaggerated pity. "We can't have you starving out there, can we? You're going to need your strength to, carry all of our gear during the next ruck march." The table right behind her burst into a loud round of laughter. I looked down at the bruised apple, then looked up at Jenna, keeping my eyes completely steady. "Thanks," I said simply. I picked up the apple and took a slow, deliberate bite out of it. Jenna's smug smile instantly faltered. She had clearly come over expecting me to cry, get angry, or throw a tantrum, not just accept it. The group behind her kept laughing, but the sound quickly became forced and awkward. I finished the entire apple, core and all, and set the tray aside. As I stood up to exit the mess hall, I walked straight past Jenna, letting my shoulder firmly brush against hers, just enough force to make her lose her footing and take a clumsy step back. The entire room went dead silent for a brief moment as they watched me walk out the double doors. The hand-to-hand combat simulation was the true test of the training cycle. It was strictly one-on-one, close-quarters combat, with absolutely no weapons allowed. The instructors paired me up against Lance, who towered over me by at least half a foot, his fists clenched tight, and a massive, confident grin spreading across his face. Before the referee could even blow the starting whistle, Lance broke protocol and charged forward, grabbing my collar with both hands and slamming me hard against the concrete wall of the training pit. The sheer force of the impact tore the fabric of my thin shirt right down from my shoulder, exposing my bare skin. The squad watching from the rails burst into a cruel round of laughter. "Look at that! She's inked up too!" Tara jeered from the front row. "What is this, a biker gang or the army?" Lance leaned his face in until he was just inches from mine, his breath hot. "This isn't a daycare, Mitchell. This is a real battlefield. Go back home, rookie." I didn't flinch, and I didn't try to pull away. My eyes stayed locked onto his, completely unblinking and dead cold. "Let go of me," I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet whisper. Lance laughed loudly, but the sheer, eerie lack of fear in my voice caused his grip to loosen for just a fraction of a second. That was all the space I needed. I stepped back, twisting out of his hold, and as I turned, the torn shirt fell completely away from my shoulder blade, revealing the full extent of the dark ink. It was a large, coiled black viper wrapping around a shattered skull. The entire training yard went instantly silent. The gray-haired colonel who had been watching from the observation deck suddenly stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly on the loose gravel as he hurried into the pit. His eyes were wide, and all the color had drained completely from his face. "Who gave you the authority to wear that mark on your skin?" he demanded, his voice actually shaking with a mixture of reverence and shock. I stood there in the center of the ring, my posture perfectly straight, the dark tattoo standing out starkly against my skin. "I didn't ask for it, sir," I told him quietly. "It was given to me directly by Ghost Viper himself. I trained as his personal student for 6 straight years." The colonel froze in his tracks. Then, without a word, his posture went completely rigid, and his hand snapped up to his temple in a flawless, textbook military salute. The other instructors and officers standing around the pit just stared, their mouths hanging open in sheer disbelief. Lance stumbled back a few paces, his face turning completely pale as the realization hit him. A young lieutenant standing by the rails whispered to the sergeant next to him, "Nobody bears that specific mark unless they were his final graduating student." Tara's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. She quickly looked down at the dirt, her hands visibly trembling against the wooden railing. During a complex tactical strategy briefing the following morning, I sat all the way in the back row of the lecture hall, my notebook open as my pen moved rapidly across the page. The primary instructor was a notoriously stern woman named Major Kleina, and she was in the middle of detailing advanced defensive perimeter tactics when she suddenly called out my name, her tone sharp as a knife. "Cadet Mitchell, do you actually have something valuable to add to this tactical layout, or are you just back there doodling in your notebook?" The entire room turned around in their seats, fully expecting me to shrink under the reprimand. I looked up from my page, held my pen still, and spoke clearly. "Your left flank is completely exposed in that canyon layout, ma'am. If you move a unit through there, you'd lose more than half your personnel in a standard asymmetric ambush." Kleina blinked, completely caught off guard by the blunt assessment. She looked back at her complex dry erase diagram on the board, then turned her eyes back to the rear of the room. "Explain yourself, cadet," she commanded. I stood up, walked down the center aisle to the front of the room, and took the marker from her hand. With a few quick, precise strokes, I drew an adjusted movement corridor on the map. "If you shift your reconnaissance scouts to this high ridge instead," I explained, pointing to the new line, "it completely cuts off the enemy's optimal angle of attack and secures the valley floor." The lecture hall was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Major Kleina stared at the adjustment for a long moment, slowly nodded her head, and looked at me with a completely different expression. "Point taken, Mitchell. Take your seat." As I walked back down the aisle, Tara leaned over and whispered venomously, "Look at the teacher's pet now." But Kleina's ears were sharp, and she snapped instantly. "Quiet in the ranks, cadet. She just saved your hypothetical lives on that board." Tara's face burned a deep crimson, and as the rest of the class turned back around, the glances lingering on me were filled with a brand new level of quiet respect. Ghost Viper. The name itself was nothing more than a ghost story within the military. A hushed whisper about a Black Ops unit that had been completely erased from official Department of Defense records 5 years ago. Nobody ever spoke about it openly in public, but the legends always lingered in the shadows. They spoke of high-stakes operations that officially never took place, operatives who vanished into thin air, and a legendary commander who took on only a handful of elite students throughout his entire career, marking each one with that specific signature tattoo. I didn't look back at the colonel, and I didn't look at any of the stunned faces in the crowd. I simply pulled the torn fabric of my shirt back up over my shoulder, grabbed my pack, and walked toward the edge of the training yard with slow, deliberate steps. The heavy, unbroken silence of the camp followed me all the way to the barracks. But Lance couldn't let it go. His massive pride simply wouldn't allow him to accept what had just happened. Later that afternoon, he marched right into the center of the common yard, his massive fists clenched tight, his voice echoing off the concrete barracks walls. "So what if she's got some fancy secret tattoo?" he yelled out to anyone listening. "That doesn't mean a thing until she proves she can handle a real, unscripted fight." The surrounding cadets looked back and forth at one another, completely unsure of what to do. I stopped walking, turned around slowly, and let my cold eyes lock onto his. "If that's what you really want," I said softly. I didn't bother to adjust my shirt or hide the mark. I just let the torn canvas hang loose, leaving the snake visible as I settled into a loose, unyielding combat stance. Lance roared and charged forward, swinging a wild, heavy right hook aimed directly at my jaw. I slipped the punch effortlessly, my body moving with fluid, practiced ease. He kept throwing heavy, aggressive combinations, screaming, "Hit me back already! Fight me!" I didn't strike him. I just kept moving just out of his reach, letting him burn through his oxygen and tire himself out until his swings grew sloppy and his breathing turned into a ragged gasp. The moment his balance wavered on a heavy overhand right, I stepped inside his guard, my arm wrapped around his throat in a flawless, mechanical rear-naked choke. A quick twist of the hips, a firm pull on the leverage point, and it was over. 8 seconds flat. Lance's eyes rolled back, his body went completely limp, and he collapsed unconscious onto the gravel. Nobody said a single word. Captain Harrow walked slowly into the center of the yard, his face completely unreadable. He looked down at the unconscious golden boy on the ground, then looked up at me, and finally turned to address the entire gathered platoon. Effective immediately, Cadet Olivia Mitchell is designated as an honorary instructor for this cycle. From here on out, you will learn close quarters combat directly from her. I didn't nod, and I didn't smile. I just picked up my worn backpack from the ground, held my torn collar closed with one hand, and walked away. The crowd of cadets quickly parted down the middle to let me through, their eyes glued to the dirt, their laughter entirely gone. The following morning, during a live-fire urban assault exercise, the instructors assigned me to lead a small 4-man fire team through a simulated city course. My team happened to include Tara, who made sure to loudly roll her eyes the second my name was announced as the team leader. As we breached the first simulated courtyard, Tara deliberately chose to ignore my hand signals to hold the line. She rushed ahead into an uncleared doorway, instantly tripping a hidden wire that set off a deafening, continuous security siren indicating a team casualty. The entire exercise was red-flagged, and Captain Harrow came storming over, his face bright red with anger. "Mitchell, your tactical stack is an absolute disaster," he bellowed. Tara smirked behind his back, whispering to Derek, "See? I told you she's completely useless as a leader." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting steadily on my rifle sling. "Cadet Tara broke the stack formation, sir," I stated calmly. "I gave the manual signal to hold the threshold, and she advanced without clearance." Harrow spun around to face Tara, who just shrugged her shoulders with an innocent expression. "I didn't see any signal, sir. she lied smoothly. She must have given it too late. A few of the guys nearby started snickering again, trying to shift the blame for the failure back onto my shoulders. I didn't waste time arguing with her. I just nodded at the captain. "Understood, sir." But as the instructors reset the course tracking systems at the main control tent, the overhead monitoring drone played back the digital footage of the breach. It showed Tara looking directly at my hand signal, rolling her eyes, and intentionally running past me clear as day. Harrow watched the playback, his jaw tightening until a muscle twitched in his cheek. He walked straight back out to the field and docked Tara's personal file, a massive amount of points for disciplinary infractions. The lingering laughter among the recruits died out instantly, and Tara's face went completely white. The entire atmosphere of the camp shifted dramatically after that day. The air felt heavier, and the constant whispers in the barracks grew much quieter. The next morning, I stood at the very front of the training yard. I had replaced my torn uniform with a plain, solid black t-shirt, and my old backpack was slung over one shoulder. I didn't bark loud orders at them, and I didn't scream to assert authority. I just stood there and demonstrated standard rifle transitions, balance points, and hand-to-hand counters. Movements that looked incredibly basic on the surface but required years of brutal, daily repetition to perfect. The cadets watched my every move like hawks, some of them frantically scribbling notes in their field manuals while others just stared in absolute silence. Tara sat all the way in the back row, her arms locked tight across her chest, her face pale and drawn. Lance was nowhere to be seen. The word going around the barracks was that he had spent 24 hours in the medical bay before being permanently reassigned to a low-level desk job at some remote radar station in the middle of nowhere. Nobody talked about him openly, but everyone understood exactly what had happened. Later that week, during a tactical first aid drill, I found myself paired up with Derek, the same guy who had flipped mashed potatoes onto my shirt on day one. We were tasked with treating a heavily bleeding simulated dummy casualty under an intense 3-minute timer. Derek, desperate to reclaim some of his lost pride in front of the instructors, aggressively shoved my shoulder aside the second the clock started ticking, reaching for the trauma bandage kit first. "I've got this handled," he announced loudly to the surrounding crowd. "You'd probably just screw up the pressure wrap anyway." But his nerves got the better of him. His hands fumbled with the plastic packaging, and he wrapped the gauze far too loosely around the dummy's thigh, causing the red simulated fluid to quickly seep through the fabric. The primary medical instructor, an experienced field medic named Carter, just shook his head in disgust. "You just let your patient bleed out, cadet. He's dead." Derek's face flushed bright red, and he immediately snapped, pointing an angry finger right at me. "She completely distracted me, sir. She was crowding my space." A few of his friends laughed out of habit, trying to back him up, but I didn't say a word. I simply stepped forward, grabbed a fresh combat dressing, and rewrapped the simulated wound in a matter of seconds. My wraps were perfectly aligned, tight, and completely stemmed the fluid flow. Medic Carter nodded his approval, clearly impressed. "Now that is exactly how you save a life under pressure," he told the group. Derek ended up storming off toward the barracks, muttering curses under his breath, but the rest of the platoon didn't join in on his laughter this time. Instead, they just murmured quietly among themselves. A few minutes later, Carter pulled me aside from the group and slid a master medic patch into my hand. "You earned this, Mitchell," he said genuinely. I took the patch, kept my expression completely blank, and slipped it safely into my backpack without making a scene. A week later, right in the middle of our afternoon maintenance break, a junior officer walked up to where I was sitting. He looked young, incredibly nervous, and was clutching a metal clipboard tightly against his chest. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping to a respectful whisper, "there is someone waiting for you at the main security gate." I looked up from my gear, my eyes narrowing slightly as I tried to gauge his expression. I stood up and followed him down the long gravel path toward the camp's heavily fortified main entrance. Standing right outside the security barrier was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a clean, short-cropped haircut and a calm face that revealed absolutely nothing to the world. He was wearing a plain black jacket and dark jeans. No uniform, no medals, no insignias. But the armed gate guards instinctively took a full step back the moment he shifted his weight. The base commander, the gray-haired colonel, was already standing out there on the asphalt, his hands formally clasped behind his back. "General," the colonel said, offering a respectful, solemn nod to the man in civilian clothes. The man didn't look at the colonel, and he didn't offer a salute. He just kept his eyes fixed on me as I walked down the path, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. I stopped a few feet away from him, keeping my own face unreadable. "You didn't need to drive all the way out here," I told him quietly. He tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching into a faint, familiar smile. "Yeah," he replied smoothly. "I did." The massive crowd of cadets who had followed me down the path out of curiosity went completely silent. Tara, who was standing near the front of the onlookers, let her plastic water bottle slip right out of her hand, the cheap plastic clattering loudly against the gravel. The colonel cleared his throat, turning around to address the gathered camp personnel. "Cadets, listen up," he announced, his voice carrying across the asphalt. "This is General Thomas Reed. He also happens to be Olivia's husband." The words hit the crowd like a physical shock wave. Reed didn't offer any further explanation, and he didn't stay to chat with the base staff. He simply placed a steady hand on the small of my back, and together we walked over to the old, mud-caked pickup truck I had driven into camp on my very first day. The heavy V8 engine roared to life with a loud rumble, and we pulled out of the security gates, kicking up a massive cloud of gray dust behind us. Nobody in the yard moved an inch until our taillights had completely disappeared down the highway. A few days later, the camp's top military brass gathered in a secure conference room for the final end-of-cycle review to evaluate the progress of the recruits. When my name finally came up on the digital slide deck, the entire room fell dead quiet. A junior administrative officer, who hadn't been present out on the training grounds and knew absolutely nothing about my history, cleared his throat and made a suggestion. Given her irregular metrics, I suggest we cut Mitchell from the leadership pipeline due to a lack of vocal command presence. The old colonel, the same one who had saluted me in the mud pit, leaned forward over the conference table, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "Mitchell's master file is classified at a level that requires a clearance none of you in this room possess," he stated flatly. "But I will tell you this much. She is the only person on this entire base who could have run this training program blindfolded." He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a heavily sealed wax envelope stamped with a distinct black viper emblem, and slid it firmly across the polished table. "Those are her official field evaluations from Ghost Viper himself," the colonel told them. "Read through those pages, and then you can tell me exactly who in this room thinks she lacks leadership." The young officer picked up the envelope, his fingers visibly trembling as he broke the seal, and within 3 lines of reading the contents, all the color drained completely from his face. The rest of the officers in the room stayed dead silent as he continued to scan the pages, his eyes widening further with every single line of text. I wasn't in that room to see it happen, but I didn't need to be. The truth of what I had done was already rewriting the entire narrative without me saying a word. The internal fallout across the military community was swift and total. Tara's highly lucrative corporate sponsorship with a major defense contractor vanished into thin air overnight after a cell phone video of her constantly mocking and sabotaging me went viral on the internet. It wasn't me who recorded or posted it. It turned out to be one of the quiet cadets who had a smartphone and a basic sense of human justice. Tara ended up slinking out of the camp a week later, her head down, her bags packed in silence as she waited for a private ride home. Lance's sudden transfer wasn't the end of his troubles either. His behavioral file came up during a routine internal review by the department brass, and he was officially discharged from the service entirely for conduct unbecoming of an officer. The rest of the recruits, the ones who had spent weeks laughing at my boots, tossing empty bottles at my feet, and kicking mud onto my hands, didn't face any formal military punishment, but they ended up carrying something much heavier out into the real world. They carried a deep, burning sense of shame, the specific kind of quiet regret that lingers in the back of your mind and makes you avoid looking at your own reflection in the mirror. I never went back to that NATO training camp. My name technically remained on the master instructor roster for the rest of the year, but I never stepped foot in a lecture hall or a training pit there again. Some people in the community rumored that I was off somewhere with Reed, running a classified black-budget training program that nobody could officially confirm. Others claimed that I had simply vanished back into the shadows, just like Ghost Viper had done years before. But the cadets who had actually seen me out there in the dirt, the ones who had watched the way I moved and felt the immense weight of my silence, never forgot a single detail. They kept telling my story to the new classes, passing the details down from squad to squad, letting the account grow over time. Not as some wild, impossible legend, and not as some mythical hero story, just as the simple, unvarnished truth of a woman who never needed to shout just to make the world listen. Years before any of that happened, I had been a completely different person. I wasn't any softer back then, but I was much younger, and my edges hadn't been completely sharpened by the reality of the world. I had spent 6 brutal years training inside a hidden mountain compound that didn't appear on any map, working under a man whose real name was never spoken aloud. He hadn't chosen me as his final student because of my family's massive bank accounts or my elite background. He chose me because of my quietness. He chose me because I knew how to listen to the silence, because I moved with absolute purpose, and because I didn't feel the need to fill the air with useless words. For 6 straight years, I absorbed everything he had to teach. I learned the mechanics of the M4 rifle, the exact pressure points of the chokehold, and the precise way to stand so that the entire room noticed your presence without you ever having to say a single word. The day my training finally concluded, he carved the tattoo into my skin himself, the heavy needle biting deep into my shoulder blade as the dark ink took hold. I remember him leaning in close, his voice steady as he whispered, "This mark isn't a badge of honor, Olivia. It's a lifelong promise." I had simply locked my jaw tight, given him a single nod, and I had carried the weight of that promise with me every single day since. Back at the base, the days following my sudden departure felt completely hollow. The remaining cadets in the platoon started training twice as hard as before, but the entire energy of the yard had fundamentally shifted. They had caught a glimpse of something real, and they couldn't unsee it. During a late-night security drill in the woods, one of the youngest recruits, a scrawny kid named Sam, happened to spot the edge of a piece of paper sticking out from beneath an empty bunk in the barracks. He pulled it out and held up my old, creased photograph, squinting in the dim light at the blurred silhouette of the man in the black jacket. "Who do you think she actually was?" he asked the rest of the guys sitting around the footlockers. Nobody offered an answer. Tara was still there in the room, packing the last of her gear into a duffel bag, but she just kept her eyes glued tightly to the floorboards. Sam quietly slipped the old photograph into his uniform pocket, not entirely sure why he was keeping it, but instinctively knowing that the piece of paper mattered too much to leave behind in the trash. The consequences of those weeks kept rippling outward. The massive defense contractor that had pulled its financial backing from Tara ended up facing a massive public relations nightmare as the training video continued to circulate across social media platforms. Their corporate stock took a noticeable dip as online military forums lit up with public outrage over how their sponsored athletes conducted themselves. Lance's dishonorable discharge wasn't just a quiet footnote in a personnel file either. His prominent family name, which had once been highly respected throughout elite military circles, quickly turned into a classic cautionary tale whispered among the academy ranks about the dangers of unchecked arrogance. Even Captain Harrow, the intimidating officer who had yelled at me for breaking formation during the 10-mile run, was eventually called into a private, closed-door meeting with the base colonel. Nobody ever found out exactly what was discussed behind those frosted glass windows, But Harrow was noticeably quieter during formations after that morning. His daily orders became much less harsh, and his eyes would constantly scan the rows of new recruits during morning inspection, almost as if he were constantly looking for something important that he had missed the first time around. My story didn't simply end when the truck drove past the security gates. It kept spreading across the country, carried along by the cadets, by the base officers, and by the persistent whispers that inevitably followed the mention of my name. The account eventually reached the ears of the older folks, the people who had spent their entire lives being misjudged by society, the ones who had constantly been told by the world that they didn't have what it takes to belong. They heard the true account of a quiet woman who had walked straight into a room full of arrogant scorn and had walked back out with a full military salute from a base commander. Those people completely understood my silence. They understood the meaning behind my steady hands, and they respected the way I never felt the need to explain myself to people who didn't matter. My journey became their journey, a powerful, quiet reminder that the truth doesn't ever require a megaphone to survive. It just requires a little bit of time. In the grand scheme of things, it was never really about the viper tattoo on my back, the 52-second rifle drill, or the chokehold that had dropped Lance into the dirt. It was entirely about presence. It was about the exact way a person carries her personal pain, her hidden past, and her absolute power, all without needing to utter a single word to validate it. I never needed to prove my worth to anyone in that camp, and I don't need to prove it now. The rest of the world always catches up to the truth eventually, just like it always does. And for every single person out there who has ever been pushed aside, overlooked, or told they weren't enough, my silence remains a quiet, binding promise. Your time is coming. Keep your feet planted, hold your ground, and remember that you are already exactly what you need to be.